Hello and welcome to Quilt Addicts Anonymous 12 Makes of Christmas series. I'm Stephanie Sebbing. For our 6th Make of Christmas, we're going to replay an oldie but a goodie. This is the Ugly Sweater Mitten Upcycle. So what you do is you go and you get a sweater that is either old or worn or you raid Goodwill, and you are going to be taught how to cut that apart and turn it into an adorable pair of mittens. And generally, the uglier and tackier the sweater, the better looking the mittens turn out, especially if they have really gaudy embroidery on it. One time I had dancing penguins right in a very bad spot. And so I cut those out and put them on the backs of the gloves, and they turned into the cutest, most adorable mittens ever. But this is a great thing to use if you've got a lot of old sweaters, or maybe you have some sentimental ones that you don't want to get rid of, but you don't want to wear. Those are good ones to get. So here are a couple of tips that you need to know in order to get a good sweater. One, you need one that has ribbing on it. So you need something that is tight to your wrist. If you're a knitter, then you know what I mean. But if it's a really wide, like this sweater that I'm wearing here today, has a super wide wrist like this would be a very terrible sweater to use because it's not going to be tight enough to hold the cuff. So you want something that is going to be very tight to your wrist, and then that way you're going to be able to use it. And if you go to Goodwill and you raid Goodwill, you can make a pair of these in about an hour for about $5. And so that's really awesome. We have the pattern available for download at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com, and you can also get fleece from us as well for the lining. I live in the Midwest. It gets stinking cold. These things keep me nice and warm because first you've got fleece and then you've got a sweater on top of it, and you can drive and you can open your keys. The only thing you can't do is swipe on your iPhone. So they are pretty cool. They're awesome and they're adorable, and they make great homemade gifts that you can make for very inexpensively. So check it out. The tutorial is next.
So let's get started. What couple of things you want to look for when you're choosing a sweater is anything that has a decorative detail across the top is going to be good. That will provide a nice little detail on the fingers of the mitten, and that's always a good thing. A couple other things you want to look for is a cuff that is ribbed. That means it stretches out like that, and it kind of tapers as you get to the sleeve. That helps because we're going to use this for the cuff of the mitten. It helps keep it nice and snug and keeps all that cold winter air out. If you have one that also has a nice little detail like these buttons, that's a nice little bonus. It just adds another little flair when you're all done. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to lay my sweater out, and I'm actually going to cut up the side seams and across the shoulder and the arm seams as well. And right now we're just going to set the sleeves aside, and we'll use those later. So I finished cutting my sweaters apart, and now what I need to do is fold them right sides together along the center seam. So it will be like along the center of your chest or the center of your back. It's the fold line that you want to fold on. And one thing that I'm making sure I'm doing is I'm making sure that I'm lining up all these lines of this Fair Isle knitting, because I want to put the top of my mitten pattern at the top of those lines so that I can match them up when I sew them together. Now I can pin my pattern pieces to the sweater, and I'm using the medium for this one. The medium fits most women's hands. The small is good for adolescent children or teenagers, and the large is good for men. But go ahead and make a test out of fleece to see how it fits you before you cut up your sweater. So I'm going to pin my front, upper front, and my back are both going to meet at the tip of this curve. So what I'm going to do for each of those is place them so that they're right in line with the top of this Fair Isle pattern with that brown. And that way I'll be able to match that up, and it will look like the pattern is going all the way around the mitten, and it was really a professional job. Now this lower front medium, that really can go anywhere. Just fit it wherever you can find place on your sweater. And then you're just going to want to pin these in place, and then we're going to cut around them as well. Alright, now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut out my pattern pieces. Now we're going to take our upper front and our lower front, and we're going to take the pins out of those, and we're going to pin those right sides together. And if you notice, on each one of these there are a couple of dots, and that's going to be our starting and stopping line for stitching. So you're going to want to make sure you put a pin there, so that way you know where to start and stop when you're sewing. Alright, so I've got them with the right side up, and you can tell sometimes real easily what's the wrong side because it looks like a bunch of gobbledygook on the others. And others, if you're familiar with knitting, there's a knit side and a purl side. The knit side looks nice with all these little V's. The purl side has a lot of bumps like this one does. So that's another way to tell the right side from the wrong side. So I'm going to lay these right sides together, and this is also a good point to have a quality check because you always want to make sure that you have a right and a left. So if all your thumbs are both going the same way, then there is a problem at this point. You need to see what's going on. So at this point, we have thumbs on opposite sides of the hand, so we're doing good. So now if you recall, there are some dots here that we want to match up from our pattern pieces. And really that just tells you where you need to stop with a needle. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put a pin in where one of those dots are. And then I'm going to come over to the other side, and I'm going to put a pin in on that side as well, even with where this dot is. And that'll tell me where I need to start my stitching and then where I need to stop my stitching. Now you're welcome to pin this as much or as little as you want. A few places that I really recommend pinning are at the top of the thumb and in this little crook where the thumb reaches out to the rest of the hand. Go ahead and do the same thing on the other side, and then we're going to get going on the sewing machine. Now I've set my sewing machine up to do a 1/4 inch stitch, and then also I put on a special setting so that it will reinforce the stitches at the start and end of my stitching. And that's really important because we need to do that whenever you do garment sewing. So what I've done here is I've set my sewing machine up so that my needle is right over that first pin which marked where the dot was on our pattern. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew all the way around my thumb and then sew all the way to the end of this as well. And then the other side is the same way, except you're going to do it backwards. And I'll show both of those on the video. We're going to do a little bit of fast forward so that you don't have to sit through it all in standard time. Now we're going to take the pieces that we sewed together along with the back piece, and we're going to go ahead and pull the pattern piece off of that. Don't throw that away yet. We're still going to need it to get the fleece lining. So again, I'm going to lay these so that the right side is facing up, and then I'm going to open up my mittens and I'm going to put the right side together. And again, this is another really good point to check and do some quality control and make sure that you have thumbs on opposite sides. Because if you had them both going one way, then you're going to have 2 rights or 2 lefts. You definitely want to have one of each so that you can wear your gloves. Now we're going to do a little bit of close-up work here because I'm going to match up all of these Fair Isle knitting lines so that you have a really nice professional detail when you put your mittens together, and no one will ever know that they're upcycled from an old sweater. Alright, so when you look at these, it's sometimes hard to tell from the back, but when you look at it from the front, when you put the right sides together, you can see that these lines come together. So we have a brown, a blue, another brown, white in between. Now you don't need to necessarily pin every single one of these color changes, but about every inch or so usually keeps you on track. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to grab my pins, and I know that I've got my brown lines lined up here. And then I'm going to line up my next set of brown lines and pin that. And I'm just going to keep going up the row. This time about an inch up we have blue. So I'm going to get those nice and lined up. And if it doesn't fit exactly, it's okay because this is a knit, so there's a lot of forgiveness in that. So you can stretch and ease some in if you need to in order to get those lines to match up, because that's what people will look at. They won't really be able to tell if your pattern pieces didn't match up perfectly from a construction standpoint, but they will be able to tell if those lines are off. So I'm going to keep going around, and then the one thing you want to do is you're going to make sure that you tuck your thumb inside like this, and then make sure you put a little pin in where your thumb line is. And that's because we don't want to sew this thumb into the seam line, otherwise it won't move. So you just want to make sure that that is pinned and tucked nicely out of the way, like that. Then the only other pins that you absolutely have to do are, you want to make sure you pin your bottom of your mitten, and you might want to put another one, you know, in between and maybe at that seam line to make sure that the seam line is going up toward the fingertips. But really the most important places to pin are going to be where these lines are coming together, because we want them to come together all the way around the fingertips as we sew them together. Now we're going back to the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam along all the sides except for the wrist, because we obviously want that open so that we can get our hand inside. Make sure you reinforce those stitches. That's going to be really important for this seam especially. Now you're going to repeat all the previous steps and create a set of mittens out of the fleece, and this will be the lining. Now we're going to leave these the wrong side out because we want to have the right side against our hand, so that's the right way. Now with your mittens that you made out of the sweater, we're going to want to turn those so that the right side of the fabric is sticking out. So you want to turn that inside out, and then make sure you get that thumb going in the right direction too. It's a lot easier now than when you've already got the mitten lining in. And you don't need to get really perfect with turning these right side out, because the mitten lining will fill that out and give it a lot of body when we insert that. Alright, so here's the fun part. This is when it actually really starts to look really neat. You're going to put your mitten lining on your hand, and then put the corresponding mitten, sweater mitten, over that. And so you should have the wrong sides of this facing each other, and then you kind of just want to manhandle the seams a little bit to make sure that the seams are in the same spot on each part and it fills out real nicely. It should have a lot of body at this point. Alright, now once you have your mitten all ready to go, we're going to baste the lining to the sweater mitten itself. And that makes it a lot easier to get the cuff on and catch everything at once. So what I like to do is I like to set it up so that my seams are going in opposite directions. And I'm going to pin those first. And I'm actually going to pin it so that the pin is going towards the inside, and that makes you less likely to get yourself. And you want to push that pin down as far as it'll go, because we really are going to be working real tightly with the sewing machine. Alright, so now I'm going to pin the other side, and again I am going to put those seams so that they're going in opposite direction. It just makes it a little easier to get through on the sewing machine that way. And have that pin set so it goes through there. Now you may have a little bit of easing in to do when you do this. So what I like to do is I like to pin a couple of times here. I'll pin in the center, and then I'll pin 1/4 of the way in between my side seams and my center pin there. And I'm going to do that all the way around the mitten, and then we're going to sew a scant 1/4 inch seam on the sewing machine to get these layers all stitched together. There's really a lot of manipulating when you're sewing this scant 1/4 inch seam, because you really can only sew a couple of inches at a time before you need to readjust where your mitten is. And what I like to do is just kind of grab it and pull the part that I'm not sewing out of the way, and I push in any pins that have popped out, so that way it's still it doesn't get in the way of that machine needle going up and down. And make sure you take out your pins. You definitely don't want to break a needle. That would be very bad. And I almost always start and stop on the bottom. That way if anything hinky happens, it's going to be on the bottom of your wrist where nobody's going to see it. Alright, I'm going to reinforce my stitches. Clip my threads, and then we're ready for the next step. Alright, now we just have to add the cuff to our mittens, and they are finished. So now it's time to grab those sleeves that you had from earlier. And what I usually do is I usually do about 4 or 5 inches of the cuff for the sleeve, because what we're going to do is we're going to cut it off and we're going to sew that raw edge to the edge of our mitten cuff and flip it over so that you won't ever see the raw edge, and then the actual finished off edge of the mitten will be the only edge that you see. So what I like to do is at least do like 4 or 5 inches, but if I have something like this one where there's ribbing, what I'll do is I'll go about 1 inch above where the ribbing ends, and that usually works out really well for folding over that cuff to conceal all those raw edges. So just go ahead and do that for both cuffs, and then we're going to be ready to pin them again. Alright, so I know this next step sounds like it doesn't make any sense, but I promise it works out. So you're going to take the right side of your sleeve and you're going to insert it against the lining of your mitten. So you're not going to do anything to it. You're not going to shut it inside out. You're just going to cut it off and stick it straight in your sleeve. And then what I like to do is I like to line up one seam with the seam line that I already have, and I'll do that with the same side of each mitten so that way there's some symmetry there. And then I just keep going the same way we did for the basting, where I'm going to pin on the other half of the seam. And then again, there might be a little bit of easing in that you need to do, but it's a knit, so that's really easy to make that happen. So I'm going to go ahead and pin in the middle, and then quarter the way in between the middle and the seam line. And I'm going to do that all the way around the cuff of the mitten. And now we're going to put it through the sewing machine, and this time we're going to sew at a regular 1/4 inch seam line so that way we can hide that basting stitch and you won't ever see it. Alright, so I finished stitching around, and now I can take that cuff out and flip it around. And now the right side is facing out, and we have a cute little mitten. And these just turn out so adorable, especially considering a lot of them are really ugly sweaters to start out with. Now you could add a button detail to the cuff if you wanted. That would help keep it in place, but I haven't really had too much trouble with it coming down as long as you make that cuff long enough. In this case, I've got a nice little button detail that was already on the sleeve that will make that nice and cute. And these are ready to go. So again, these make great gifts. They're really warm. I live in the Midwest where the winters can get pretty brutal and there's a lot of snow, and these definitely keep me warm as I'm driving to and from work and out shoveling snow. And they're cute and they're cheap to make. So definitely go raid your local thrift store or your old closet for sweaters that maybe don't fit anymore, or even if they have a little hole in them, you can cut around them. And also I used to do craft shows, and now I don't have time to do them anymore because this website has gotten too big, which is cool. But I'm basically unloading all of my old sweaters that I pulled up I pulled to make these mittens from, and they've all been freshly washed and they have the fleece to go with them. So all you have to do is check out and you get the pattern, the sweater, and the fleece all shipped to you so that you can make your own upcycled sweater mitten. Thanks for following along, and even though we didn't do any quilting, I'll still end by saying happy quilting.